She walked away from the cold-hearted CEO, convinced he'd never change. But years later, when fate brought them back together, it was him begging for a second chance, and the truth she carried changed everything. Section 1. The Night That Changed Everything. The ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, the soft hum of violins playing in the background as the elite of New York City mingled with cocktails in hand. It was an evening of prestige, of whispered deals and veiled ambitions, where fortunes were made, and alliances were cemented under the guise of pleasantries. For Hannah Lawson, however, this night was anything but ordinary. She stood at the edge of the grand room, her fingers gripping the slender stem of a champagne flute, though she had barely taken a sip. Her reflection flickered in the polished marble floors, an elegant navy blue dress hugging her curves, dark waves cascading over her shoulders, her emerald green eyes betraying the storm within. Across the room, standing near the towering windows that overlooked the dazzling city skyline, was Damian Cross. Her breath hitched. Even after all these years, he was still undeniably magnetic, tall and commanding. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he was the very picture of power. His silver-gray eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the crowd, every movement exuding authority. Damian Cross wasn't just any man. He was the CEO of Cross Enterprises, one of the wealthiest and most formidable businessmen in the country. His name was synonymous with success, a legend in the corporate world. But to Hannah, he was something far more dangerous. He was a temptation she had once barely survived. And tonight he was walking straight toward her. The moment his gaze locked onto hers, everything around them faded. The chatter, the music, the clinking glasses, it all became nothing more than white noise. "You're avoiding me," Damian murmured, his voice a smooth blend of steel and silk as he came to a stop before her. Hannah swallowed hard. "I wasn't aware we had anything to discuss." A shadow of a smirk touched his lips, though his intense gaze never wavered. "That's where you're wrong." Her fingers clenched around the glass, 1,000 unspoken words tangling in her throat. It had been 3 years since she had walked away from him. 3 years since she had left behind everything, the wealth, the opulence, the intoxicating allure of being by his side. And yet, standing before him now, the past came crashing back with ruthless clarity. Damian had been everything she thought she wanted. The way he looked at her, the way he made her feel as if she was the only woman in the world. But she had learned the hard way that love meant nothing to a man like Damian Cross. "Marry me, Hannah." His voice from that night still echoed in her mind. A proposal that had sounded more like a transaction than a confession of love. Because Damian didn't love. Damian possessed, and she had refused to be owned. "You left without an explanation," Damian continued, his voice lower now, edged with something unreadable. Hannah forced a breath through her lips. "I gave you my answer that night, Damian. I don't regret it." A flicker of something, hurt, anger, flashed in his silver eyes before it vanished beneath his composed mask. "You walked away from us," he said, his voice chillingly even. "From me." Hannah lifted her chin, steel creeping into her tone. "There was never an us, Damian. You made that very clear." His jaw clenched, his fingers curling at his sides. For the first time, something cracked in his expression, something raw and unguarded. "Is that what you really believe?" His voice had a dangerous softness now, a challenge laced beneath the question. Hannah hated how her pulse still reacted to him, how the memory of his touch haunted her in ways she refused to admit. But this time, she would not let him pull her back in. She took a step back. "Enjoy your evening, Damian." And before he could stop her, she turned and walked away. That should have been the end of it. She should have left that gala, hailed a cab, and returned to the quiet, simple life she had built for herself. But fate had other plans. Hannah had barely made it to the elevator when she felt it, the sudden dizziness washing over her, the sharp pull of nausea. She gripped the polished brass railing, her vision swimming for a moment. No, not now. She had been pushing herself too hard lately, working long hours, barely eating. She couldn't let herself collapse here. Before she could steady herself, a strong hand caught her elbow. "Hannah?" Her eyes fluttered open and her stomach clenched. "Damian." The concern in his gaze was fleeting, quickly replaced by something unreadable as he studied her pale face. "You're not okay," he stated bluntly. "I'm fine," she muttered, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened, not painfully, but firm enough to keep her from swaying. "Stop pretending." His voice had lost its edge, softened just enough to make her chest ache. She didn't want this. His concern, his presence, the way he still knew when something was wrong. But what hurt more was knowing that he had never been able to give her the one thing she had truly wanted. "Damien," she exhaled, her voice weary. "Please, let me go." For a moment he didn't move. Then, with a long exhale, he released her. But his gaze never left hers. "One day you'll tell me the real reason you left," he murmured, his tone almost a promise. And with that he turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of people. Hannah sagged against the railing, pressing a trembling hand to her stomach. Because Damien had been right about one thing. She had left him for a reason. And that reason was growing inside her. The next morning, Damien Cross disappeared from her life. No calls, no messages. It was as if she had never existed. Section 2. The Secret She Kept. The small apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast gentle shadows across the modest room, highlighting the neatly folded baby clothes on the dresser and the crib tucked into the corner. Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, a hand resting on her swollen stomach as she gazed out the window at the city skyline. New York had always felt suffocating, but tonight it felt even smaller. She had left the gala hours ago, and yet Damien's voice still echoed in her mind. "You walked away from us." He would never know the truth, she had made sure of that. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. There was no point in wishing for something that was never real. Damien Cross had never loved her. He had offered her security, a life of luxury, but never love. And she had known, deep down, that if she had said yes to his proposal that night, she would have spent the rest of her life as nothing more than another possession in his empire. Hannah had grown up without wealth, without privilege. She had clawed her way up, taking extra shifts as a waitress while juggling her college classes, barely scraping by. She had met Damien during an internship at Cross Enterprises. He had been untouchable, a man who moved through the world with ruthless efficiency, his presence commanding every room he entered. And yet, for some reason, he had noticed her. At first, she had been skeptical. Men like Damien didn't fall for women like her, but he had pursued her relentlessly, in his own cold, detached way. Dinners in penthouse restaurants, exclusive getaways, stolen moments in between his high-powered meetings. And she had fallen for him. Hard. But when she had wanted something real, something more than whispered promises and stolen nights, she had seen the truth in his eyes. Damien didn't believe in love, and she couldn't build a life with a man who didn't have a heart to give. So she had walked away. She had convinced herself it was over, until 2 months later when she had stared down at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands, her entire world tilting on its axis. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. She was keeping this baby. And Damien, he would never know. The decision had been easy. Damien Cross lived in a world of power and control, where every move was calculated, every relationship transactional. He would see this child as an heir, not as a person. He would try to mold them into a smaller version of himself, stripping them of warmth, of love, of the very things she wanted her child to have. She wouldn't let him. She had spent the next few months quietly cutting every last tie to him. She left New York, moved to a quieter part of the state, and found a modest job as an administrative assistant. It wasn't glamorous and money was tight, but it was hers. And when her son Noah was born, she knew she had made the right choice. He had Damien's eyes, a deep, piercing gray filled with the same quiet intensity. But where Damien's gaze had always been cold, Noah's were filled with wonder, with life. Everything she had ever feared had vanished the moment she had held him in her arms. He was hers, and she would never let Damien take him away. Years passed in the blink of an eye. Hannah had learned to live with less sleep, with endless piles of laundry, with scraped knees and late-night fevers. Every day was a battle, but it was one she fought with everything she had. Noah grew into a bright, mischievous boy, with a laugh that could light up the entire room. He loved books, just like she did, and had a habit of tilting his head when he was thinking. Just like Damien, she never spoke his father's name, he never asked, but she knew the day would come when he would. And when that day arrived, she would be ready, or so she thought, because fate had other plans. Hannah was running late. The daycare was already closing by the time she rushed through the doors, her coat slipping from her shoulder, her bag barely clinging to her arm. I'm so sorry, she panted, flashing an apologetic smile at the daycare director, an older woman with sharp eyes but a soft heart. Relax, dear, the woman chuckled. Noah's been perfectly fine. He's been talking my ear off about some new story he's writing. Hannah let out a breath, relieved. That sounds like him. She hurried toward the small reading corner where Noah sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a picture book. His dark curls bounced as he looked up, a bright grin spreading across his face. Mommy! He leaped into her arms, his small hands wrapping around her neck. Hannah kissed his forehead. Hey, sweetheart, ready to go home? But before he could answer, another voice cut through the room. A voice that sent ice down her spine. Hannah? Her breath stopped. Slowly she turned, and there he was, Damian Cross. Standing in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor, his piercing gaze locked onto her and the child in her arms. Everything inside her went still. This wasn't happening, and it wasn't possible. Her heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. Damian shouldn't be here, he couldn't be here, but he was. And the way his gaze flickered between her and Noah, his expression unreadable, his breath shallow, told her one thing. He knew. He knew who Noah was. And just like that, everything she had built, everything she had fought for, began to crumble. Damian couldn't move. He couldn't think. For years he had buried the pain of her rejection, drowning himself in work, in power, in anything that could distract him from the one woman who had ever truly made him feel something. And now she stood before him holding a child, a boy with his eyes, a boy who, despite the small features inherited from his mother, was undeniably his. His pulse thundered. The realization hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. She had kept his son from him. For years. Anger coiled in his chest, a slow, burning fire. But beneath it, beneath the shock and the betrayal, was something far worse. Something he had never expected to feel. Fear. Fear that he had lost something he could never get back. Fear that it was already too late. Hannah's grip on Noah tightened, her green eyes flashing with warning. She was afraid of him, of what he would do, of what he would say. But Damian didn't speak. He couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, Damian Cross was at a loss for words. Section 3. A Battle of Wills. Hannah's pulse pounded violently in her ears. She could feel the weight of Damian's piercing gaze, the unspoken accusations flashing behind his sharp, unreadable eyes. Noah stirred in her arms, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. Mommy! The little boy tilted his head. Who's that man? Hannah's heart seized in her chest. She had prepared for this moment for years, the day Noah would ask about his father, but not like this. Not here, not with Damian Cross himself standing less than 5 feet away. She swallowed hard, her grip tightening around Noah. No one important, she said, her voice steady but cold. A sharp, bitter scoff left Damian's lips. No one important? He repeated, his jaw clenching. That's funny, Hannah, because if I didn't know any better, I'd say that child in your arms. His gaze flickered to Noah, then back to her. Is mine. Hannah's stomach twisted painfully. She had spent 5 years keeping this secret. 5 years ensuring Damian would never know about Noah. Now, it was unraveling right in front of her. And Damian Cross, he wasn't the kind of man to let something like this go. She forced herself to breathe. Stay calm, stay in control. You're mistaken, she said flatly. He's not your son. Damian's gray eyes darkened. Try again, Hannah. He took a step forward, his presence as commanding and lethal as she remembered. The same way he dominated every room he walked into. Unstoppable, immovable, unwilling to back down. Let's not play games, he murmured, his voice low, dangerous. The moment I saw him, I knew. I see it in his eyes, in his face. Hannah's entire body stiffened. No. She had to shut this down before it spiraled out of control. I don't have time for this. She turned sharply on her heel, adjusting Noah in her arms as she headed toward the exit. Don't follow me, Damian. But the second she stepped outside, his voice stopped her dead in her tracks. I'll do a DNA test. The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Hannah's breath hitched. She turned slowly, meeting Damian's unwavering stare. Noah, sensing the tension, buried his face into her shoulder, his small fingers clinging to her coat. A wave of protective instinct surged through her. She would not let Damian take this from her. She squared her shoulders. There will be no test, she said, her tone like steel, because there is nothing to prove. Damian's lips pressed into a thin line. his expression chilling. "Is that so?" he murmured. The way he said it, low, calculating, deadly, made her blood run cold. Hannah knew Damien. She knew his ruthless determination, his need for control, the way he never let anything slip through his fingers. And now she was his target. She had to get away. Without another word, she turned and strode down the sidewalk, Noah still tucked securely in her arms. Damien didn't follow, but she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hannah had spent the entire night tossing and turning. Noah had gone to bed hours ago, curled up with his favorite stuffed dinosaur, peacefully unaware of the chaos brewing around him. But Hannah, she couldn't silence the storm in her head. She had built a life away from Damien. She had worked tirelessly to create a world where he didn't exist. And now, he had found her. And worse, he knew, or at least he suspected. A knock at the door made her freeze. Her stomach dropped. It couldn't be him. Hannah slowly rose from the couch, her heart hammering as she approached the door. She peered through the peephole. Damien, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his tall frame towering in the dim hallway, his expression set in stone. She squeezed her eyes shut. Why couldn't he just leave? Another knock. "Hannah," his voice was firm, unyielding. "Open the door." She hesitated. Damn him. He would stand there all night if she didn't. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the lock and pulled open the door just enough to glare at him. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice low, controlled. Damien studied her. "Let me in." Hannah let out a sharp laugh. "Not happening." He exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose like he was holding on to his patience by a thread. "Fine," he said, his tone cool but clipped. "Then I'll say it here, in the hallway." Hannah's fingers clenched around the door. She hated how he was always so damn composed, so unshaken, while she was barely holding herself together. He leveled her with a gaze that made her skin prickle. "I want the truth." Hannah's stomach twisted. She kept her voice steady. "You already got my answer, Damien. He's not yours." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Liar." Her breath caught. "I don't care what you say," he continued, his voice dropping lower, more lethal. "I know, Hannah. I see it. He's mine." Panic clawed at her throat. "Lower your voice," she hissed, glancing toward the hallway, fear creeping in. She couldn't let Noah hear this. She couldn't let him wake up to this nightmare. Damien didn't move, didn't blink. He was waiting, watching for her to break. She gritted her teeth, stepping forward until she was close enough to smell his cologne, to feel the heat radiating off him. "If you think for 1 second that I will let you waltz into my son's life and rip everything apart, you are sorely mistaken." His eyes flickered, a flash of something unreadable. For a second, just a second, she thought she saw something in his gaze. Not anger, not control, but pain. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Damien leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't get to decide that, Hannah." Her throat went dry. "He is my son too," he continued, every word like a knife. "And I will not walk away again." She flinched. Because those words were the worst thing he could have said. He thought she was the one who had pushed him away. She wanted to scream, to tell him that he was the one who left, that he was the one who chose power and money over her. But she couldn't. Because Damien Cross was a man who could take everything away from her, and she wasn't willing to risk Noah becoming another one of his acquisitions. Her lips parted, but before she could say anything, a small voice broke through the silence. "Mommy." Both of them turned. Noah stood at the end of the hallway, his small frame bathed in soft moonlight, his big gray eyes blinking up at them sleepily, and Damien's breath hitched, because there it was. Proof, the final confirmation. Noah was his, and now there was no going back. Section 4. The walls begin to crumble. Damien stood frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the small boy who had just emerged from the hallway. Noah's tiny hands rubbed at his tired eyes, his messy curls sticking up in different directions, a clear sign that he had just woken up. But it was his eyes, those sharp, stormy gray eyes, that sent a violent rush of realization through Damien's chest. It was like looking into a mirror, his hands curled into fists. He had suspected it the second he saw the boy at the cafe. But now? Now there was no doubt. Hannah must have felt his body stiffen because she moved instantly, stepping between him and Noah like a shield. "Noah," she said gently, kneeling in front of her son. "Sweetheart, what are you doing up?" Noah blinked sleepily. "I heard voices." he mumbled. Who is that man, Mommy? Hannah's back went rigid. Damien's stomach twisted. His own son was looking at him like a stranger. Something inside him cracked. Hannah smoothed her hands over Noah's curls, her voice carefully composed. Just someone Mommy used to know. But he was just leaving. Damien's jaw locked. Leaving, not a chance. Not after this. Noah tilted his head, glancing back at Damien, studying him in the same intense, analytical way Damien himself used to examine people. He swallowed hard. The urge to say something, to claim what was his, burned at the back of his throat. But he didn't. Not yet, not here. Not when Noah had no idea who he was. Instead, he took a slow breath, forcing the chaos inside him to settle. I'll go, he finally said, voice low, gaze locked onto Hannah's. But this isn't over. Hannah's hands tightened around Noah. She knew exactly what that meant. Damien turned, his footsteps heavy against the hardwood floor as he stepped outside, into the cold night air. But this time, he wasn't walking away forever. He had a son, and he was going to fight for him. The next morning, Hannah could still feel Damien's presence lingering in the air. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the way he had looked at Noah, the silent shock, the devastation, the raw, unspoken emotions he had tried to bury. But more than that, she felt the fear, not fear of Damien himself, fear of what he could do, fear that now that he knew about Noah, he wouldn't stop until he had control. She refused to let that happen. Not after everything she had sacrificed to give her son a normal, happy life. Not after the lonely nights she had spent wondering if she had made the right decision, choosing to keep Noah away from the world Damien thrived in, a world of power, ruthlessness, and relentless ambition. Hannah loved her son more than anything, and she wouldn't let him become a pawn in Damien's game. Not now, not ever. Still, she had no idea what Damien's next move would be. She found out soon enough. It started at Noah's school. When she arrived to pick him up that afternoon, she immediately felt it. The shift in energy, the lingering glances from the other parents, the hushed murmurs. The moment she stepped onto the playground, one of the teachers, Mrs. Porter, gave her a sympathetic look. Hannah, dear, the older woman approached hesitantly. You had a visitor today. Hannah's stomach dropped. A cold rush of panic surged through her. No. Mrs. Porter continued, her voice careful. A man, tall, impeccably dressed. He introduced himself as Damien Cross. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. I told him we don't usually allow unexpected visitors during school hours, but he was quite persuasive. The woman frowned. He didn't try to see Noah. He just asked about him. Hannah's throat tightened. Of course he did. This was so Damien, and he didn't barge in. He didn't cause a scene. No, he worked in the shadows, gathering information, positioning himself, strategizing. This was a warning, a reminder that he was one step ahead of her. Mrs. Porter hesitated. Is everything all right, dear? Hannah forced a smile. Yes, it's fine. It was a lie. Nothing was fine. She needed to act fast, because this was just the beginning. That night, she found Damien waiting for her outside her apartment. Again. His posture was casual, leaning against the side of a sleek black car, but his eyes were anything but. She knew that look, and he wasn't leaving until he got what he wanted. She stormed up to him, her fury barely contained. What the hell do you think you're doing, Damien? He didn't blink. I should be asking you that. Hannah let out a harsh laugh. Oh, I don't know, maybe raising my son alone because his father vanished without a word? Damien's eyes flashed. You're blaming me? His voice was low, dangerous. Hannah, you were the one who left me. Her breath hitched. Left him? Was he serious? She stepped forward, her hands shaking with anger. You're unbelievable, she whispered, voice raw. You chose your empire over me, Damien. You made it clear that I didn't fit into your life, so I made sure I didn't. Damien's jaw clenched. That's not how it happened. She let out a hollow laugh. Then what, Damien? Enlighten me. How did it happen? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I made mistakes. I was blinded by what I thought mattered. But I never would have walked away if I had known about Noah. Hannah froze. His voice had shifted. No longer sharp, no longer cold and calculating. Instead, it was something else. Something she wasn't prepared for. Regret, real, raw, unfiltered regret. And for a split second, just one, She saw something in Damien's eyes that made her chest ache. A man who wasn't just angry. He was hurting, but she refused to let that sway her, because no matter how much pain he carried, it didn't erase what he had done, or the fact that he could take Noah away from her. She lifted her chin, forcing her walls back up. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice firm. "You don't get to just show up years later and act like you deserve a place in his life." Damien's expression hardened again. "That's not your decision to make." She swallowed. "Like hell it isn't." Damien stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think I'll walk away from my own son?" His gray eyes burned into hers. "You think I'll just accept being a stranger to him?" Hannah's throat tightened, because deep down she already knew the answer. Damien Cross was a lot of things, but a man who gave up? Never. And for the first time since he had returned, she felt it. The walls around her carefully built life were starting to crumble. This wasn't a fight she could win alone, and that realization terrified her. Section 5. A Battle of Hearts. The next few days were nothing short of a storm waiting to break. Hannah did everything she could to maintain her routine, to act as if nothing had changed. But deep down she knew she was fighting a losing battle, because everything had changed. Everywhere she went, she felt Damien's presence even when he wasn't there. When she dropped Noah off at school, she glanced around, expecting to see him watching from a distance. When she walked into her cafe, she caught herself half expecting to find him sitting in the corner, sipping his espresso, waiting for her. When she lay in bed at night, she swore she could still hear his voice, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. "You don't get to decide if I'm in his life." Hannah shut her eyes tight, trying to block out the memory. But it was useless, because no matter how much she fought it, Damien Cross was back. And this time, he wasn't leaving. Damien was a man of action. He had spent his entire life making the impossible happen, turning failing companies into billion-dollar empires with nothing but his ruthless ambition and unshakable will. So when it came to his own son, failure wasn't an option. He had given Hannah space after their confrontation, but not too much, just enough to let her breathe, to make her believe she was still in control. Because Damien knew how to play the long game, and he wasn't just here to win a battle, he was here to win the war. His first move, showing her that he was serious. Hannah's cafe was busier than ever that week, the morning rush flowing in as usual. She was behind the counter, focused on steaming milk for a cappuccino, when she heard a familiar voice. "How much for a coffee, Miss Carter?" Her heart stopped. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She did anyway. Damien leaned against the counter, suit flawless, his sharp gray eyes fixed on her. Hannah's grip on the steaming pitcher tightened. "What are you doing here?" she asked through clenched teeth. He raised an eyebrow. "Ordering coffee, that's what people do at a cafe, isn't it?" Her patience was already thin. "Damien!" But before she could snap at him properly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a check. Hannah barely glanced at it before her entire body went rigid. Because the number written on it was astronomical. "Consider it an investment," he said smoothly, watching her reaction. A wave of anger crashed through her. She grabbed the check and ripped it in half, letting the pieces flutter onto the counter. Damien barely blinked. "Try that again," she said, her voice low and sharp, "and I swear I'll throw this coffee in your face." A slow smirk curved his lips. "Ah, there she is." Hannah narrowed her eyes. What is that supposed to mean? His gaze drifted over her, unreadable yet piercing all the same. "The woman who never let anyone intimidate her," he murmured. "Not even me." She hated that his words sent a shiver down her spine. She hated that he could still rattle her like this. "I don't need your money, Damien." He tilted his head slightly. "No, you don't. But Noah does." Hannah stiffened. There it was, the real reason he was here. He wasn't here for coffee. He wasn't here for her. He was here for their son. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "Not even a father for Noah?" She sucked in a sharp breath. Damien pushed off the counter, stepping closer. "I'm not walking away, Hannah," he said, voice calm but undeniable. "You can throw away my money. You can pretend I don't exist. But you and I both know the truth." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm his father, and I'm not going anywhere." Hannah's chest tightened, her pulse pounding too fast, too loud. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him he didn't deserve that title. But deep down, a part of her knew he was right. And that realization terrified her. After their confrontation at the cafe, Hannah couldn't think straight. She spent the entire night pacing her apartment, glancing at Noah as he slept, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Because if she had learned anything about Damien, it was that he never backed down. And the next morning she was proven right. She had just dropped Noah off at school when she saw him again. This time, waiting outside her apartment. His posture was relaxed, one hand in his pocket, but his gaze was sharp, unwavering. He had been waiting for her. Again. Hannah clenched her jaw and marched toward him. "This is stalking, Damien," she hissed. "You're not welcome here." "I don't need an invitation," he said smoothly. She scoffed. "That's funny because I seem to remember rejecting you the first time we met." His lips twitched into a smirk. "And yet here we are." She gritted her teeth. Damien stepped closer, his expression turning serious. "You can keep fighting me, Hannah, but you and I both know how this ends." Her pulse stuttered. "How does it end?" she challenged. His gray eyes locked onto hers. "With me in Noah's life, one way or another." The words sent a rush of panic through her. "Are you threatening me?" His gaze darkened. "I'm making you a promise." Her breath hitched. Damien never made empty promises, which meant that no matter how hard she fought, this battle had only just begun. Section 6, The Storm Before the Truth. Hannah's mind was racing as she slammed the door behind her, breathing heavily. Damien was relentless. She knew that better than anyone. But this, showing up at her apartment, cornering her in her own space, it felt like a battle she wasn't prepared for. She paced her living room, fists clenched at her sides, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest, because she knew that if Damien truly wanted to be in Noah's life, she might not be able to stop him, and that terrified her. Because Damien Cross was a man who, once he set his sights on something, never let go. Damien stood outside Hannah's apartment watching the closed door, his jaw clenched tight. She was running from him again, and he hated it. He had spent years trying to erase her from his mind, convincing himself that he had moved on, that she didn't matter. But the moment he saw her again, the moment he found out about Noah, everything unraveled. He wasn't just a man trying to fix his past mistakes anymore. He was a father, and there was no way in hell he was walking away from his son. Pulling out his phone, he dialed the one person who could help him understand his legal rights. Hannah sat at her dining table that night, pushing around her untouched dinner, her thoughts spiraling. The fight with Damien had left her drained, her mind spinning with possibilities. What if he tried to take Noah from her? What if he used his power, his wealth, his connections, to drag her into a custody battle? The thought made her stomach churn. She had built a safe, stable life for Noah, one where he didn't have to feel abandoned, where he didn't have to know the pain she had suffered. And Damien, he was chaos, the kind of chaos she couldn't allow near their son. Her fingers tightened around her fork as she made a decision. She had to get ahead of this. She had to protect Noah before it was too late. Damien sat in his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the city skyline. The lawyer's words replayed in his mind. "You have every right to petition for paternity, but without proof, it's a battle of statements. If you want to claim legal rights, you'll need a DNA test." A DNA test. Damien hadn't thought about it before, but now the idea wouldn't leave him. Because if Hannah was so certain that she wanted to keep Noah away from him, why wouldn't she just prove he wasn't the father? The thought sent a slow, calculating smirk across his lips. If she didn't fight the test, then he had the truth in his hands. And if she did fight it, that told him everything he needed to know. The next morning, Damien was at the cafe before it even opened. Hannah stepped inside, startled when she saw him standing by the counter. "Are we really doing this again?" she muttered, setting her bag down. Damien folded his arms across his chest. "Let's get straight to the point, Hannah." She let out a sigh, rubbing her temples. "You never had a talent for small talk, did you?" "No." His gaze hardened. "And I don't have time for games either." Something in his tone sent a chill down her spine. "What do you want now?" she asked warily. "A DNA test?" Hannah's breath caught. The room suddenly felt too small, too dangerous. "No," she said immediately. Damien didn't blink. "Why not?" Hannah's pulse was pounding, because she couldn't lie. She couldn't tell him that Noah wasn't his son. He would see right through her. So instead she squared her shoulders. "Because you don't get to waltz back into my life and demand things, Damien." His jaw tightened. "This isn't about you and me anymore, Hannah." She knew that. She knew that. But she had spent years protecting Noah from disappointment, from heartbreak, from men who walked away, and she refused to let Damien be one of them. "What happens when you get your results?" she challenged. "You think you can just claim a child you abandoned years ago? That you can make up for lost time with a checkbook and a fancy title?" Damien's eyes darkened. "I don't throw money at things I care about, Hannah." Her breath hitched. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I'm not asking you any more," he said softly. "I'm doing the test with or without your permission." Panic spiked through her. She had no way out, and for the first time in years, Hannah felt like she was losing control. Hannah's hands shook as she drove home that night. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to steady herself. She had fought so hard for so long to keep Noah's world simple and safe. But Damien was about to tear that apart. She couldn't let that happen. She had one option left. She needed to talk to Noah. She parked in front of her building, took a deep breath, and went inside. Noah was sitting at the kitchen table, scribbling in his notebook, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Mom, look, I drew a picture of us." Hannah's chest ached as she sat beside him, running a hand over his messy curls. She hesitated. Then she said the words she had been avoiding for too long. "Noah, sweetie," she exhaled shakily. "There's something I need to tell you." His green eyes widened. "What is it, Mom?" Her throat tightened, but before she could speak, there was a knock at the door. Her stomach dropped. She already knew who it was. Noah jumped up excitedly. "I'll get it!" "Noah, wait!" But it was too late. The door swung open and Damien Cross stood on the other side, his sharp gaze locked onto them. For the first time, father and son stared at each other, and in that moment Hannah knew. The truth was no longer hers to control. Section 7. When the past collides with the present. The air inside Hannah's apartment turned thick with tension as Damien and Noah stood face to face. For Damien, it felt like the world had stopped moving. The boy in front of him? He wasn't just some vague idea of fatherhood. He wasn't just an argument in a cafe or a battle of legal rights. Noah was real, and he looked so much like him. The same piercing green eyes, the same unruly dark hair, even the way he tilted his head. Damien had seen a picture of himself as a child doing the exact same thing. Noah blinked up at him, curious but unafraid. "Mom!" The boy turned toward Hannah. "Who's this?" Hannah felt the ground sway beneath her. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, feared it, prepared for it. But now that it was here, she had no idea what to say. Damien's gaze flickered to her, demanding an answer. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Noah, sweetheart, this is Damien Cross." Noah frowned. "The guy from TV?" Damien's lips twitched despite the gravity of the situation. "So you've heard of me?" Noah nodded. "You're the business guy, right? I saw you in a commercial once. Uncle James said you're kind of scary." Damien let out a short breath of amusement. "Your uncle's not wrong." Hannah wanted to disappear. This wasn't how she had planned for them to meet. Not with Noah's innocence hanging in the balance. Noah tilted his head again, studying Damien. "Why are you here?" Hannah held her breath. This was it. The moment Damien would say something that would change everything. She braced herself for the truth, but then Damien surprised her. Instead of claiming Noah as his son, instead of declaring his rights, he crouched down to the boy's level and simply said, "I wanted to meet you." Hannah's heart pounded. Damien was being careful, gentle. She hadn't expected that. Noah hesitated. "Why?" Damien held his gaze. "Because I think you're a very special kid." Noah's frown deepened. "Mom." Hannah exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling. How was she supposed to explain? How was she supposed to tell her son that the man standing before him wasn't just some businessman on TV? He was his father? She turned to Damien, silently pleading with him. "Not now, not like this." Damien studied her for a long moment. Then he stood, slipping his hands into his pockets. "You're right, Noah," he said casually. "I do business, but sometimes I like to meet new people too." Noah's suspicion eased slightly. Damien wasn't forcing this. He wasn't barging in and throwing everything out of balance. Instead, he was pacing himself. Hannah didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. "Can I take you two out for dinner?" Damien suddenly asked. Hannah stiffened. "Damien, I'm just asking for a meal," he interrupted, his voice smooth but firm. "No strings attached, no fights, just dinner." Noah's eyes lit up. "Can we, Mom?" Hannah hesitated. But before she could say no, before she could tell Damien to get out and never come back, She saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. Patience. And that's when she realized Damien wasn't going to force this, but he wasn't going to walk away either. This wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about revenge or proving her wrong or undoing the past. This was about Noah. And whether she liked it or not, Damien was in his life now. Hannah inhaled deeply. Fine, she said. One dinner. Damien's smirk was slow, confident. Great, he said. I know the perfect place. The restaurant was too fancy. Hannah knew that the moment they walked in. White linen tablecloths, dim candlelight, a sommelier on standby. It was exactly the kind of place Damien Cross would choose. Noah, on the other hand, was unimpressed. Do they have chicken nuggets? He asked, glancing at the menu. Damien chuckled. I think they can make some for you. Hannah sighed. Damien, this is too much. Relax, he said smoothly. It's just dinner. But she wasn't worried about the price, she was worried about what came next. Because every second they spent together, Noah was starting to like Damien. And that was dangerous. Noah stuffed a bite of his fries into his mouth. Do you have kids? He asked Damien. Hannah's fork froze midair. Damien's jaw tightened ever so slightly. No, he said, I don't. Noah chewed thoughtfully. Why not? Damien's grip on his glass tensed. Hannah held her breath. Because I never knew I wanted them, Damien finally admitted. Noah blinked at him. And now you do. Damien looked at Hannah, then back at Noah. Yeah, he murmured. Now I do. On the drive home, the weight of the evening pressed down on Hannah's chest. Noah was asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the window. Damien drove in silence, his grip steady on the wheel. Hannah finally turned to him. Why are you doing this? Damien didn't look at her. You know why. She swallowed. It's not that easy, Damien. His grip tightened. I'm not expecting it to be. Hannah shook her head. You think you can just show up, take us to a nice dinner, and fix everything? It doesn't work like that. Damien's jaw tensed. I know that, Hannah. She folded her arms. Then what exactly do you want? The car slowed as Damien pulled into her driveway. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was unreadable. I want to be in his life, he said, and I want you in mine. Hannah sucked in a sharp breath. I don't trust you, Damien. He nodded slowly. I know. She searched his face, trying to find the ruthless man she had once known, but he wasn't there. Instead, she saw something she never expected. Regret, longing, and something terrifyingly close to hope. Damien let out a quiet sigh. Take your time, Hannah, he murmured, but don't shut me out. She didn't answer, because she didn't know how. Later that night, Hannah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Noah's soft breathing filled the apartment, but her thoughts were on Damien. He had been different tonight, not perfect, not redeemed, but different. And that was what scared her the most, because if Damien had truly changed, then maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as sure about her feelings as she thought. Section 8. A battle of hearts and the walls between them. The days after the dinner were filled with a strange new normal. Damien didn't disappear. He didn't push, didn't demand. But he also didn't leave. He showed up for Noah, for Hannah. At first, Hannah thought he would lose interest. She told herself that billionaires like Damien Cross weren't built for patience, that he'd get bored and move on. But he didn't. He was at the school gates when Noah got out of class. He took him to the park on the weekends. He learned that Noah loved puzzles, but only the ones that had exactly 500 pieces, because anything less was too easy, and anything more was too much of a commitment. He figured out that Noah hated tomatoes but loved ketchup, that he could name every dinosaur but had never been to a museum, that he liked bedtime stories but only when someone actually acted them out. Hannah watched, helpless, as Damien became a part of Noah's world. And worse, she watched as Noah let him. One evening, Hannah stood at her window, watching them from inside the apartment. Damien and Noah were sitting on the front steps, solving a puzzle together. Noah was talking excitedly, his small hands moving as he explained something. Damien was listening, not half-heartedly, not distracted, but truly listening. Hannah felt something deep in her chest tighten. She had spent 7 years building walls. Walls that kept them safe. Walls that made sure they would never be hurt again. But now Damien was finding cracks in those walls. And worse, he wasn't breaking them down. He was waiting for her to lower them. That scared her more than anything. She tried to talk to Noah about it, to remind him to be careful, to remind him that Damien wasn't always going to stay, but Noah just shrugged. "He's different," he said simply. Hannah's breath caught. "He's still Damien Cross," she murmured. Noah tilted his head, considering. "Yeah," he said, "but I think maybe he's still figuring out who that is." And somehow that scared her even more, because Noah wasn't wrong. Damien had changed. But Hannah wasn't ready to believe in that change. Not yet. One afternoon, Damien showed up outside her office building. Hannah barely had time to register him before he stepped in front of her car, forcing her to stop before she could drive away. She rolled down the window, glaring. "Are you insane?" Damien smirked. "You weren't answering my calls." Hannah sighed, rubbing her temples. "That's because I don't want to talk to you." Damien leaned against the hood of her car, utterly unfazed. "That's unfortunate," he said, "because I'm not going away." Hannah clenched her jaw. "I don't want to do this with you, Damien." He crossed his arms. "Do what exactly?" She let out a sharp breath. "Whatever this is, you being around, you showing up all the time." Damien's expression didn't change. "I'm Noah's father. And I'm his mother," Hannah shot back. "I raised him alone. I protected him alone. And I'm not about to let you come in and undo everything I worked for." Damien's gaze darkened. "You think I want to undo it?" Hannah swallowed hard. "I think you don't know what you want, Damien. And that's what scares me." Damien exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know what I want, Hannah." She shook her head. You want control. You want to fix things. You want to be the Damien Cross who always wins. But life doesn't work that way." Damien's jaw tightened. "This isn't about winning." "Isn't it?" she whispered. For a moment, they just stared at each other, and then Damien did something unexpected. He stepped back. Hannah frowned. He studied her for a long moment, then said, "If you need space, I'll give it to you." Hannah's stomach twisted. "What?" Damien's voice was quiet. "But I'm not leaving, not from Noah's life." She swallowed hard, feeling something dangerously close to regret, but she forced herself to nod. "Fine." Damien held her gaze for another second. Then he turned and walked away. Hannah sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. She had expected a fight. She had expected Damien to argue, to force his way back in. But instead, he was giving her the choice, and that somehow made everything so much harder. Days passed. Damien kept his word. He didn't push. He still saw Noah, still showed up for him. But with Hannah, he was careful. He gave her space. And for the first time, she didn't know what to do with it. Because somehow, Damien Cross had gone from being the man she hated to the man she wasn't sure she could live without. And that terrified her. Because what if she let herself believe in him again, only for him to walk away all over again? But what if this time he really was here to stay? Hannah wasn't ready for that answer. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't ignore him forever. Section 9. The past that won't stay buried. Hannah told herself she was doing the right thing. She told herself that keeping Damien at a safe distance was the only way to protect herself, that even though Noah was happy, she couldn't let herself fall for Damien all over again, because once she had trusted him, and once he had shattered her. But the past had a way of refusing to stay buried, and no matter how much she tried to run from it, there were still pieces of it waiting in the shadows, ready to drag her back. It started with the letter, a simple white envelope tucked under her apartment door. No return address, no sender. Just a single sheet of paper inside, the words scrawled in jagged, familiar handwriting. "You really thought you could hide forever?" Hannah's breath caught. The world tilted. Her fingers clenched around the letter as something cold and sharp crawled up her spine. It had been years, 7 years. She had done everything to escape. She had changed her number, moved to a new city, built a new life, and yet somehow he had found her. She barely heard Noah's voice as he walked into the room. "Mom, are you okay?" Hannah blinked, forcing her expression into something neutral as she shoved the letter into her pocket. She couldn't let Noah see, couldn't let him feel her fear. She turned to him, offering a small, shaky smile. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm fine." But she wasn't, and she had no idea what to do next. By the time she got to work, her hands were still trembling. She tried to shake it off, to focus, but her mind was spinning. She barely noticed when Damien stepped into her office. "Hannah," he said, his voice low. "Are you all right?" She stiffened. She couldn't tell him, couldn't drag him into this. This was her problem, not his. "I'm fine." she said quickly, turning away. Damien's sharp gaze flickered over her. He knew her too well. He stepped closer. "You're lying." Hannah swallowed. "It's nothing, Damien." He studied her, his jaw tightening. She braced herself for an argument, for him to demand answers, but instead he said, "If someone's hurting you, I need to know." His voice was quiet, serious, dangerous. Hannah hesitated because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure she could handle this alone. That night she found another letter. This time it was taped to her car window. She ripped it open with shaking hands. "You think he'll save you? He won't. He never did before." Hannah's heart pounded. She spun around, scanning the street. Nothing, just darkness and street lights. Her breath came fast and sharp as she climbed into her car, locking the doors. And for the first time since Damien had reappeared in her life, she didn't feel angry. She didn't feel resentful. She felt terrified. She didn't mean to call Damien and didn't mean to press his name in her contacts, her fingers trembling as she dialed. She almost hung up, until his deep, steady voice came through the line. "Hannah?" She sucked in a breath. Her voice barely came out. I need you." A beat of silence, then Damien's voice dangerously calm. "Where are you?" 20 minutes later, he was there. He pulled up in his car, stepping out without a single word. His face was unreadable as she handed him the letter. Damien read it slowly. Then he looked up, his expression dark. "Who sent this?" Hannah shook her head. "I don't know, Her voice broke. Damien's jaw clenched. She wasn't used to this side of him. Not the cold businessman, not the calculating CEO, but the man who looked like he would burn the world down for her. He inhaled deeply, then said, "You're coming with me." Hannah blinked. "What?" "You and Noah, pack a bag. You're staying at my place." Her stomach twisted. "No, Damien, I can't." "You can," he cut in, "and you will. You're not safe here." Her breath caught. Because the terrifying part wasn't that someone had found her. It wasn't the letters. It was the fact that, for the first time in 7 years, she wanted to lean on him. She wanted to trust him. And that, more than anything, was what scared her the most. The next morning, Hannah woke up in Damien's penthouse. Noah was still sleeping, curled up in a bed bigger than he was. She walked into the kitchen to find Damien already awake, standing by the window with a phone pressed to his ear. His back was tense, his shoulders rigid. She caught only bits and pieces of the conversation. "I don't care how much it costs. Find out who sent those letters." A pause. "I don't want guesses. I want a name." Another pause. Then, "Whoever they are, they just made the worst mistake of their life." Hannah swallowed. Damien wasn't just protecting her, he was hunting. And for the first time she realized this wasn't just about the past. This was about him, about what she meant to him, and whether she was ready to admit it or not. She wasn't the only one with something to lose. Damien was fighting for her, for Noah, for them, and this time he wasn't going to let go. Section 10. The choice that changes everything. Hannah had spent years convincing herself that Damien Cross didn't matter anymore, that his betrayal, his absence, his decision to walk away, none of it had power over her. But standing in his penthouse, watching him make calls to hunt down the person threatening her, watching him protect Noah with an intensity that terrified her, she realized something. She had been lying to herself, because if Damien really didn't matter, then why was she so afraid of trusting him again? Noah was safe. That was the only thing she focused on. After the third letter had arrived, Damien had doubled security. 2 guards were stationed outside his penthouse. Cameras had been installed at every possible entry point, but Hannah knew it wasn't enough. Because this wasn't just about letters. This was about someone who wanted to destroy the life she had built, and she still didn't know who it was. "Come with me," Damien said one evening. It had been 2 days since the last letter arrived. Hannah frowned. "Where?" "My office." She hesitated. She had avoided stepping foot in Cross Enterprises for years. It was his domain, his world, the place that had once taken priority over her. But Damien's gaze was firm. "I need you to see something." The elevator ride to the top floor was silent. The last time she had been here, she had been begging him to choose her, and he had let her walk away. The memory burned inside her as the elevator doors opened to the sleek, sterile world of Damien's empire. But this time she wasn't here to plead for anything. This time she had the power, and Damien knew it. The glass walls of his office gave a panoramic view of the city, but Hannah barely looked. Her focus was on the desk and the file sitting on top of it. Damien gestured for her to sit, then slid the file toward her. She hesitated, then opened it. Her breath caught, because inside were years' worth of information, not just about her, but about Noah. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Medical records, school transcripts, a life Damien had never been part of. She looked up, heart pounding. "You knew," she whispered. Damien's jaw was tight. "I found out 2 years ago." Hannah's stomach dropped. 2 years. He exhaled, running a hand down his face. "I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know if you'd ever want to see me again. So I watched from a distance. I made sure you were okay, that he was okay." Hannah's mind reeled. He had known for 2 years, and he had done nothing. Anger, hot and sharp, rose inside her. "You had 2 years to step up," she said, voice shaking. 2 years to be in his life, and you still chose to stay away." Damien flinched, but he didn't look away. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you wouldn't let me in. Afraid you'd tell me I didn't deserve to know him." "You don't," Hannah snapped. A tense silence filled the room. Damien let out a slow breath. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't deserve anything, but I'm not walking away again, Hannah. I can't." Her chest ached, because she had spent years believing he didn't care. And now, sitting in front of her, was a man who had never stopped caring. That night, Hannah lay awake. Noah was asleep in the guest room. Damien was on the phone in the living room, talking to someone about security upgrades. And Hannah was falling apart, because she had spent so long protecting herself, so long convincing herself that Damien was the past. But now, the past was standing right in front of her, refusing to leave. And the worst part? She didn't want him to. The next morning, Damien found her in the kitchen, gripping a cup of coffee like it was the only thing holding her together. He leaned against the counter, studying her. Then quietly, "I'm not giving up on us." Hannah closed her eyes. "You should." Damien shook his head. "I should have fought for you back then," he said. "I should have been there for you. For Noah. I made every mistake possible. But I'm done running, Hannah." He stepped closer. "Give me a chance to fix this." She let out a broken laugh. "Fix this?" She gestured between them. "You think this is something you can fix?" Damien's gaze was steady. But I think it's something I can make right." Her breath hitched, because damn him for looking at her like that, like she was the only thing in his world that mattered, like he was willing to fight for her this time. Hannah set down her coffee. "Damien," she whispered. His eyes darkened. "I'm scared," she admitted. I don't know if I can trust you." "I know that too." She swallowed hard, and then, "Finally," she whispered, "then prove it." Damien didn't hesitate. "I will." Over the next few weeks, he did. He took Noah to school. He showed up. Not with grand gestures, not with diamonds or luxury, but with consistency, with patience, with love, and slowly, Hannah let herself believe. The day she finally let go of the past was the day she watched Noah run into Damien's arms. The man who had once walked away was now the one who never left. And for the first time in 7 years, Hannah allowed herself to believe in something she had sworn she would never trust again. A second chance. Damien wasn't perfect, he never would be. But for the first time, he was fighting for something more than business deals and power. He was fighting for his family. For her, for them. And as he pulled her into his arms that night, whispering a quiet, "I love you," against her skin, Hannah finally let herself whisper it back. Because after everything, after all the pain, the distance, the mistakes, they had finally found their way back to each other. And this time, neither of them was letting go. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story that stays with you. See you in the next one. See you in the next one. See you in the next one.